Can we have folks settling down? Great, thank you. Folks at the back, would you like to join in? Great, thank you. Lovely to see so many familiar faces and many new friends. Thank you very much. I am Shuchi. I work with the Global Resilience Partnership, and I lead this, or steward this community of practice around resilience measurement and evidence called the Resilience Evidence Coalition. This is co-led by CDK and SSN and ACAD, or ACAD with the LUC, the Least Developed Universities Consortium. And we work on putting resilience evidence and the right kind of resilience evidence into use. We also co-hosted the Resilience Evidence Forum earlier this year, which some of you may have heard of, read about, watched, hopefully, and joined us. And this session is meant to be an extension from that one around how we measure locally led adaptation. We have a lovely group of people who shall be talking about their experiences, their learning, and how we can further South-to-South cooperation, learning around locally led adaptation. Now, the format is a fishbowl, so we hope that everyone would love to contribute. If not, I know a few people I can put on spot, so I will. It's a small group, we're all friends, so feel free to jump in. The format is a bit of a rapid fishbowl that we are trying out. We have 3 people who will act as provocateurs, who will basically start. So we have Aita who will start, and then we have Charles and Nadia. And after each speaker, we will have a round of conversations, which could either be responses or building on the conversations that they would have begun. With that, I'll invite Aita to join us from Youth for Nature. Aita. And please introduce yourself, and let's begin.
Okay, hello everyone. I believe this is so conversational, so I'll try to be as relaxed as possible. So I'm Aita Joshua Apamaku, and I'm from Uganda. So I do work with Youth for Nature. And currently I am leading on the Nature-Based Solutions program track. Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's working. Thanks, Aita. So we start with the first question, and this is also a question to everybody. And Aita, if you could start with sharing locally led adaptation in practice. We've heard quite a bit about the principles, we've heard about what it means, but we are still, still fuzzy over the operationalization of what locally led adaptation could mean in practice. So could you share a little bit about your experience around your work, how you put that in practice, how initiatives work with Youth for Nature?
Okay, thank you very much. So one thing we have to understand is that locally led adaptation is something that is new in policy, but on ground it has always been in practice for so long. And I'll relate this as well to the work we have been doing on nature-based solutions. So when we talk about locally led adaptation, we are looking at how people in a community live their day-to-day lives. Different kinds of ecosystems, be it forested ecosystems, be it open savannas, whatever kinds of ecosystems. People have ways of life, they have traditions, biocultural relations they have with their natural ecosystems that within they thrive. So at Youth for Nature, we came up with the Inuka program. So Inuka comes from the Kiswahili word, rise up. So yes, we acknowledge the challenge that youth face in accessing opportunities, accessing resources to implement projects. Yes, we are experts, we are learning fast, but then there are also communities there are also resilient communities which we must acknowledge. However, with the Inuka project, we realized that it's also one of the key messages in the nature-based solutions statement we launched about 2 years ago, and it comes down to nature-based solutions prioritizing biodiversity conservation, and it must be grounded in rights. So the approach Inuka took is that it goes down to citizen science. First of all, the project design involves community. They are the ones who identify what the problem is. They propose solutions that they feel are relevant for their ecosystems. And what Inuka does is facilitate peer-to-peer learning, interaction, between the communities, the youth groups that are involved, and each and every stakeholder that is on board. And with Inuka, it looked at 5 different ecosystems, 5 different ecosystem types. So currently it's in Kenya, and it works there's also the coastal ecosystem, there's the dryland ecosystem that's in Marsabit, there's also one that's closer to the Savo, which represents the savanna scale, and then there's one within Nairobi, which is kind of replicating the urban scale. So the program takes on knowledge sharing, acknowledging that yes, there's traditional knowledge that forms the baseline, but then there is also modern science. So how do we balance the two to ensure that what we are doing is inclusive? And then there is the concept of capacity building. Yes, the project, it has started as a pilot project, but one thing we must acknowledge is that it is about constant learning. So we look at projects as constant learning, constant monitoring, constant evaluation, and that is also what forms the basis of evidence. So whatever work you do, you're actually creating evidence that will form the baseline for another project in the near future. So that's now constant capacity building. And with storytelling, yes, we do complicated work. In reports, we put lots of jargons here and there. But how do you bring it down to your personal relationship? How do you connect to it? So that's what we do through Inuka. That's one reason as to why we looked at different ecosystem types and also putting people and nature. So it's people communicating to their unique ecosystems in which they thrive. So that's the whole approach we've been carrying out with Inuka, which is co-creation and citizen science, generally.
those words sound like music to my ears. Co-creation and citizen science. Opening up to the audience behind and here in front, if you have any examples to share or any lessons where you think there are commonalities or differences with all that Aida has shared right now, please feel free to join us. One round of quick fishbowl. Someone has to open.
No, there's many ideas that resonate here. I'd like to make, yes, sorry, I'm David Gonzalez from Global Resilience Partnership, based in Mexico. And there's many ideas here that resonate. One of those is the fact that locally led adaptation has been taking place since before it's been in documents. And secondly, the role that people have in connection with nature, right? And there's another session going on at the Resilience Hub right now that it's actually talking about socio-ecological systems, which is a great approach to look at these connections between people and nature, which I think is key if we want to build adaptation and resilience. One of the key issues, I think, is we need to break the divide, like the artificial divide of resilience or adaptation, land and loss and damage, and mitigation, because when it comes to the communities, it's not the way that it's seen, and it's also not the way that the initiatives that are taking place at the local level are actually taking place. And just to highlight the matrix of ecosystems and human-nature relations that we see at the local level, I see it as well in the projects in Mexico where I'm involved, where you don't have an isolated system, you have a complex matrix of ecosystems, a complex matrix of relationships. You have many pressures also from the external world pushing towards certain aspects. And you have also the resilience of people who are trying to continue their livelihoods, taking action at the local level, but also taking action that actually has a lot of impact in terms of resilience for the greater scale. And we see it, so last year in Mexico, for example, we had a hurricane arriving to the coast of Oaxaca, and this year we had a hurricane arriving to the coast of Acapulco, and we saw the contrast in the impact just by changing the system that it was impacting. How we saw it, for example, in local communities where there were lots of human connections, there was a lot of work done in social capital, which actually led people to be able to bounce back, but also to connect and diversify the way that they interact with their context. Whereas in the case of Acapulco, where a lot of the social connections and the social capital has been destroyed by the pressures of tourism and capitalism, have actually led to a situation where an effect like this one has had a lot of issues trying to, for people to actually bounce back to an effect like this.
Thanks, David. You can sit or you can go back, whatever. Feel free. Awesome. Thank you. Right. Anyone else? Any responses? Any thoughts? Any ideas around? I know it's going. Is there any wonderment about why LLA and people and nature? Why the conversation has kind of shifted to people and nature, or just questions around that? Please feel free to provoke as well. No questions, no thoughts, yes?
Okay, hello everyone. I am Afsara Mirza. I'm currently working with the International Center for Climate Change and Development based in Bangladesh. And I think it's a very important discussion that we're having. But I just wanted to resonate with what both of you said, but also wanted to speak on an initiative that we're doing on behalf of ECAD. That is, we have launched our national platform on locally led adaptation 1 year back, where we're trying to really collaborate with diverse actors nationally and subnationally who are working with grassroots organizations. And we're kind of working as a knowledge broker in order to unfold what locally led adaptation means in the national context, but also that we have 8 divisions in Bangladesh. So now we are trying to take up more of like a bottom-up approach of how we can, solidify the learnings that we got from the national platform and really take the message in the grassroots level. And what we're doing is every month we're trying to open a divisional platform in 8 divisions. By now we have launched 2 divisional platform, and in the next year we plan to scale that up into 6 other divisions just to be a knowledge broker and really identify who the grassroots actors are and how can we support them in terms of really unfolding the principles of locally led adaptation, but also work alongside them to reflect on the successes and the failures.
Thank you. That's super. Thank you so much. Thanks, Aita. In the next round, so we'll shift gears a little bit and we'll start talking about what this means for governance and negotiations, what these stories in practice mean for actually measuring LLA, because these processes have only begun, although LLA has been around forever. It's important that governments understand this. It's important that negotiators understand this, and therefore this articulation of LLA has come about. And we need to figure out how we start thinking about it in terms of metrics. So I invite Charles, who's busy on his laptop. Charles is a busy man. And Charles is from the Africa Research and Impact Network, and I'll hand over the mic to you to introduce yourself and then ask you a question.
Thanks, everyone. Maybe before I introduce myself, the question is, where are the most vulnerable communities in our programs, especially the research focusing on adaptation and locally led adaptation? And the discussion so far, we are from a session focusing on co-producing metrics for adaptation, and we're asking ourselves, for whose metrics are we co-producing? Thank you very much. I'm Charles Tonui. I'm an engagement and policy dialogue coordinator at the Africa Research and Impact Network, and I'm very passionate in advancing what Salim was passionate about, community-based and locally led adaptation, and we are co-convening in Sub-Saharan Africa discussions bringing together both the various clusters, local communities, and also policymakers.
Thanks, Charles. Question for you. You've been engaging quite a bit with the Kenyan government around the locally led adaptation metrics that you're creating. If you could tell us a little bit about the metrics themselves, but also what's the pitch to governments? What's the positioning that you're taking to the governments in terms of why should this mean something to them?
Excellent. Thank you for those fundamental questions. First, I will say the discussion, especially at the national level and the subnational level and at the local level, are quite different. The outcome of the conversation we had at the Africa Climate Summit after the Resilient Evidence Forum is there was realization, like using one indicator or metric or factor like GDP, development production. That one, even if it's growing at the national level, it doesn't even reflect at the subnational and local level. Secondly, there is acknowledgement by the policymakers that is the urgency to really look at indicators at the subnational level and the local level. But the complexity is, one, the policymakers first do not have the capacity, yet they are debating on the budgets and they are debating on the distribution and even reporting And when you ask, what frameworks are you reporting? If you remember at the Resilience Evidence Forum, I was asking, who is involved in co-development of a reporting framework from the subnational level? And I think there are only 4 hands. So a third is this policymakers, particularly at the subnational level. They are engaging with us very strongly, and you'll see the Kenya Pavilion today at 4:45, where we are now going to the communities through the funding from IDRC, looking at the locally led co-produced adaptation metrics. So the action that comes to the policymakers is we need to co-develop a customized capacity building program for the policymakers so that they can appreciate and understand why the priorities of these most vulnerable communities sometimes outsmart or overruns what the policymakers are raising. The second question was on, if you could come.
The positioning of the governments in these spaces, in global negotiations and other spaces.
Yes. I'll borrow from the high-level policymakers, including our President for the Republic of Kenya, where now researchers like the Africa Research and Impact Network, we have got membership of close to 200, where we are now placed, or policymakers are opening doors for us to co-develop, especially these metrics, and also up to the planning level. Last week, we co-launched what we call Building Climate Resilience for the Urban Poor Plan, which was launched in New York, and Kenya is a champion in Brazil. And for the first time, the government allowed RIN to facilitate the development by looking at the composition of the actors. And secondly, to develop the plan up to this level where we are now launching and going forward to co-implement. But above all, is the working relationship that we have had with the high-level policymakers in terms of, second, documenting. Yesterday, we had an informal meeting with the Steps Change program, and we raised the question around how do we communicate, or which platforms are we engaging in? And I think this is where policymakers are also appreciating that their term is very short in office, and researchers have to be in these platforms and also their approach, so that when they are moving, researchers will be able to pick up, or they can be part of the research community.
Thank you. That's great. That's a very optimistic answer, and something very different from what we are hearing outside, right? The negotiations don't always lend to such conversations. And opening up to the larger audience, if there's any responses or thoughts or points around, especially around the global processes and how they interact with these national and subnational processes, please feel free to join in.
Thank you so much. Hi, it's Mary from CDCAN. My pleasure to see you again, Charles. So for the past couple of weeks, I was involved with the Global Goal on Adaptation pre-meetings and negotiations. And I mean, it's not just Kenya national government going forward with a position, it's AGN. You know, it's like the whole continent of Africa trying to come up with a proposal. And they've been saying we would like a target around livelihoods, resilience of livelihoods to be considered with it now. The GGA talks are not going well. So I can't promise that this is what is now being agreed in the hallways. But this is something coming forward from Africa Group. So I suppose I'm just brainstorming with you here. You're looking at the very nuanced needs and priorities at the community level, at the local level. Is there a place, do you think, for having a kind of common denominator, I almost want to say lowest common denominator, target that is adopted, in the GGA framework, in the international talks, which is general enough that it could be applicable in, a coastal marine ecosystem environment, in a dry land, arid environment, and then is kind of contextualized. But then the community kind of works with that and can report up to county, up to national government, up to African Union level, up to global level, that common denominator, but then it can layer on all its other community-driven needs for MENL. What do you think?
First, let me give one of the outcome of the discussions we had under the UNFCCC on measuring and reporting. Adaptation finance Green Climate Fund, all these, they are using different metrics. And it came from the Adaptation Fund. You see the complexity now. And harmonizing fast from the tools to the metrics, there was an agreement. It's quite complex. But what are we infusing, especially as ARIN and working with the policymakers, which we have agreed now, both informally and likely to be formal, is the question now that we give the communities a chance, and all of us a chance to go back, especially using the initiative that we have so far, and listen to the communities for the first time and document well to amplify those voices and look at what are the implications in terms of that paradigm shift that we are anticipating. Because one, metrics, they'll be very different on the clusters from up to the financing. So what, in terms of action towards now looking at the harmonization is, can we listen to the voices of these vulnerable communities from the different ecosystems across sub-Saharan Africa? And I think there is an agreement, and today in the this afternoon, you'll hear that voices from the policymakers, which they have already agreed with us, that let's give them time, the space, and really document those, because already the whole ecosystem is quite complex. Because the planning at you'll find there'll be Ministry of Treasury. And Treasury, they are using conventional development indicators, where they based on the plans, but the plans are not delivering so far for East Africa. For instance, look at El Nino. When you are coming to the Africa Climate Summit, there was an announcement that El Nino will be coming, but look at the magnitude and the impact is already overstretching the mainstream development programs and even the humanitarian relief. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Opening it up to the audience again. Any thoughts on the, I guess there's a tension here, very clear tension here around holding governments accountable at the global level, right? With like very clear lowest common denominator metrics almost, and the question of co-creation with communities so that we hold those nuances as well. And any thoughts from the audience on this tension and how is it that, if there are any examples of having managed this tension of rigor that's needed, accountability that's needed, and the co-creation process that's needed, and the time that's needed as well. Thoughts? Yes? Join us? Join us. We wouldn't have left you. Join us.
Mine is very brief. My name is Johannes Atela, and I work with Charles. Yeah, I mean, thinking about the local and national linkage, it's not new that there has been push for the inclusion of local voices in these decisions. So it's not, we are not doing anything new. The big question is, who has been representing the voices of these communities, and how are they doing that? And number two, it's also about the institutional frameworks at the local level, because one of the fundamental gaps that we have today in terms of strengthening the voices and the aspirations, and relates to the question you asked, Shushi, about how do we, and I think you've also asked it, the common denominator. One of the most fundamental challenge we have today is that things are a little bit scattered at the local level, and the way some of the lessons or some of the best practices from the communities have been represented has not basically taken into account the local institutional setup. So there is a fundamental need really to really think about ways of strengthening those local frameworks, because it is those local frameworks that can really carry the messaging and can be able to sort of build some form of common denominator that then can represent a much more inclusive view or perspective from the local level. At the moment, we are not doing so much to strengthen those local institutions. We are more, I would say we are more extractive, you know, and this is why I asked the first question, who is representing the local communities and how are they doing it? So think about locally led adaptation and matrices that we are talking about today. It's a question of really how do we begin to strengthen those local systems so that they can package, you know, or consolidate the information at that level. And then through a co-creation with the researchers, it is possible to bring up some form of aggregated perspectives that carries different groups within the communities. And the time is now, and because I've said this before, and I want to repeat it, that there is a shift in terms of what the climate discussions or climate action focus is looking at. I look at COP28 and what I see is more of an investment-driven COP. While there are talks of resilience and adaptation and all that, if you look at, we had a brief discussion on global goal on adaptation, you look at where those conversations are going. The plight of the vulnerable community is being phased out in the global climate discussions. And I know as a resilience community, we are doing a lot, but I think it is time for us to rethink how we are going to engage with these processes. Otherwise, in this complexity of shifting from vulnerability-based COPs to more investment-based COPs, the voices of the marginalized and the suffering communities are going to get lost, and we're going to lose more and more. Thank you.
Excellent. We are just getting started, I guess. That's a brilliant provocation. Yes, Aita, please come in. And I guess, feel free to sit, feel free to go, but yeah, please come in. And I guess the question we're holding is whether this tension between whether we have vulnerability focus within our COP discussions or investment focus, and are they a tension at all is probably a question that we're holding. Aita, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think mine is also an addition to the question and statement he made, and it goes down to how do we qualify or quantify traditional knowledge. Say, for example, when we're carrying out needs assessments for projects in communities, there's normally a research design people use. You'll go with a random sampling and so on. But there was a recent needs assessment study I was involved in in August, and we were doing work around the edges of a forest park. So our aim was to rank what activities were being conducted most by people in a day and how relevant was that to their daily lives. So we're ranking the two and checking out the correlation. But we realized that one of the community members said, yes, one of the community members said that ecotourism is one of the practices that was being promoted, but that's not what they wanted. What they needed was agricultural extension services. So in other words, the needs assessments that were being conducted didn't address the challenge, and rather it was trying to address something else that was not the problem. So how do we quantify this traditional knowledge and ensure that we don't have this hanging knowledge gap?
Absolutely, that is quite difficult, and I think through the ARA micrograntees, we did look last year, the previous year and last year, especially the informal settlement, looking at the comprehensive climate risk assessment. And when you looked at the tools, I think for those who are aware, if you have looked at the database for climate risk assessment tools, they are close to 790 the last time I saw. And we had to map who are the institutions, including IFRC. We had a conversation now, one-on-one, Red Cross Organization, Care International. And you look at these tools, and we were interrogating the tools. If we go to the communities, can these tools really pick the needs, the impacts? And what we revisited our approach and went with the key common indicators or the matrix areas, and we sat to the communities. And there was a whole upside down turn of the whole process. And I think we reported last time. So getting the communities, especially to their priorities, is not easy, because the way investments, like what my colleague Jones is saying, currently we are looking at the investment approach, and it's only, there is a risk of private sector driven. Then the most vulnerable groups are likely to be forgotten, because we still yet to understand the multi-hazard risks and how it's impacting the cascading risk. Let's say, for instance, Kenya now, there is El Nino, and what likely drought, there are other risks. Now, how do we understand those impacts unless we invest from ourselves as researchers and resources and time to engage with the communities and take time? Yesterday, somebody gave us in our group a story that you have to stay like close to more than 2 months or 2 years, I think so. Yeah, and we were recommending in one of the projects that spend at least 3 months so that you can first build trust with the communities. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. But the conundrum of this investment and vulnerabilities is very interesting. I don't know if it's a tension, and I'm again opening it to the audience. If anyone wants to kind of provoke or poke at this question and has thoughts around this question. Yes, please, why don't you join us?
Good evening, I'm Bosco John Juma. I come from Kenya. I work with an organization known as Big Ship. It's a community-based, community-led mangrove conservation and community development organization back at the Kenyan coast. And I appreciate to be here and to hear this conversation about the nexus between investment, conservation, and communities. And with my 15 years working with community and restoration, I've seen a lot of transition in terms of how people do conservation and how community adapt in the changing climatic and programming in terms of conservation program. And talking about investment, we are now in the era of carbon credits, and I wanted to specifically touch on that and how it is impacting how community have been doing conservation over time and how things are changing with the current scenarios, because the carbon credits conversation has been taken up overboard, I'll say that. And I was in a conversation the other day, and most of the private sector are looking into that space. Most of the banks and insurance companies. I heard about mangrove insurance for the first time in this scope. And what does that mean? People are looking at conservation from the capital point of view and return on investment aspect. And in Kenyan coast, especially in the mangrove space, traditionally, mangrove restoration was part and parcel of the community engagement on how they restore in their degraded space. But of late, after COP and after a lot of money pumped into the carbon credit space, I don't want to call them middlemen, but those who want to capitalize in that space, they come with their own narrative and metrics on how they want restoration to be done in the local communities. And that changes the ballgame on how restoration is being done. And that's something that I've seen firsthand. And young people mostly who have been in that space, because I work with young people in the restoration space, are now being turned into not a restoration agency, but agents of funding schemes in the conservation space. A good example I can give is in our Kenyan space, I was, by 2014, I was doing some restoration. Back in 2010, we have over 15-year-old trees that have been planted over then. And we are doing what we call ecological mangrove restoration, which is basically following the same ecosystem to do the restoration of the mangrove. It means you need to understand the zoning. Mangrove have different species, and mangrove is very unique. It requires not very salty, a very specific amount of water, the right soil, the right environment, and when that happens, it grows very fast. But with this coming of now people investing into that space without considering the science behind it, people are planting hazardously everywhere you come. Now because the communities have been doing it in their way and they don't have the money and the muscle, now you are being pushed because someone has to do it because carbon is coming. And I think that one is actually reducing the nature-based solution aspect of restoration and also making it not very sustainable. Because when you do nature-based restoration space in that, in the true sense of it, it will mean that the community are gradually restoring and also benefiting out of it. But when it is on the monetary point of view, is I'm paying you, you plant, and then that's it. Someone wants to get credit at the end of the 3, 4, 5 years. Your planting ended in the first, second, third year, and someone has 20 years of return on investment, which probably what comes to the community is not naturally, because ecological restoration and nature-based means you are getting not just the non-monetary value and the ecological value, but on the monetary part of it, of restoration, it's on the monetary aspect that comes to you as a household. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a brilliant example. Thank you. Today morning we heard of, at least I heard of this for the first time, malmitigation is something we need to consider within nature-based solutions and especially locally led adaptation. Thank you for sharing that with us. And very pertinent, I guess, something that IPCC apparently is thinking about as well. Charles, thank you so much. And with this, we get into the last round. I'm conscious of time. We have about 10 to 15 minutes more. And I invite Nadia from CDKN. And Nadia and I have been close conspirators and friends. Thank you for joining us, and please introduce yourself.
So, hi everyone, I'm Nadia Sitas. I'm based on the CDKN program, which is the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, based at South North. And I'm the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Thematic Lead. I'm also a coordinating lead author of the IP-based assessment, the Nexus assessment. And so it's this interesting mix of science, policy, practice, and trying to work between all of those different domains.
Excellent, thank you. We're shifting gears a little bit and going into this aspect of South-South learning, and metrics are, at the end of the day, yes, they're about accountability, but they're also about learning and also about learning what we glean out of this. And we, as the Resilience Evidence Coalition, which is GRP, CDKN, ICAD, ARIN, and others who've been part of this process, have been learning about measurement and learning about the metrics themselves. And Nadia, if you could shed some light around that process of learning.
Sure, and it's amazing to come now when everyone has shared so many incredible examples of some of the learning that we've been able to capture and some of the learning that we still need to capture. So we've been over the course of the last, actively over the last year, but really over the last couple of years of trying to bring and convene spaces where we can have this peer-to-peer learning, really bringing people together to share what's worked, what hasn't. You mentioned in the session earlier, also bringing our failures and being quite honest about what hasn't worked so that we don't do the same things over and over again. And what we found in trying to look at the evidence for locally led adaptation, but also trying to make sure that we're bringing in ecosystem-based approaches, approaches that are people-centered, what we found is that there's not too many examples of rights-based approaches, and especially how do you bring in rights-based approaches and then into the metric and measurement scheme. So what do you measure? I think with LLA, you're often measuring maybe the outcomes or the process. So what would a good measure for ensuring that you bring rights into that? Because also involved in the NACT report, which was almost like a global stocktake of nature-based solutions, there really aren't good examples of how rights-based approaches have enabled or facilitated multiple co-benefits for these types of approaches. So I think there's so many questions and ways that we still need to convene discussions. We also brought people together around kind of the Resilience Evidence Forum, around the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Knowledge Day, which was digging into the global stocktake. So the technical report was released, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar with maybe some of the contents, and it informs the discussions that we're having. And really, what is the missing? So we've got amazing opportunities to learn from actions that are happening at the ground, but the missing kind of intermediary role is sometimes not there in terms of connecting that to some of the metrics and indicators that global processes require. So some of the learning is how do we learn how to bridge that gap? What knowledge is there? What knowledge is still missing? But also maybe mobilize action. So we don't have to wait for the evidence to the perfect evidence, the perfect metric. How can we start implementing and learning on the go? And I think that's really important because we just don't have the time. And if you look at the private sector, they're innovating all the time and bringing in new technology without waiting, right? They'll update it in the next couple of years. And so I think we really need to start doing that as well because the power is already in the room. I think if we were to just sit now for another hour, we'd probably come up with incredible examples of how we can start thinking about LLA in different ways.
Thanks, Nadia. Final bit of opening up to the audience and questions around learning as practice. Questions around learning as praxis and a focus on South-to-South learning. And we have Sibel, no one better than you coming in to talk about this. All right, Sibel, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Nadia. So I'm Sibel Queiroz, and I work for the Global Resilience Partnership. I'm also a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And so part of my work is exactly to try to get ways of assessing and measuring and getting good measurements of quite holistic and complex processes, such as sort of like local initiatives working with transformation, so sort of with transformative change for sustainability, for things like peace building, which are like sort of extremely complex. And so I'm really, and it's a question, I guess, like to you, but also like to everyone, because it's like, I think one of the challenges is that even when we, like on the research side and on the, and doing like knowledge co-production and sort of, when we sort of have quite holistic frameworks for like assessing sort of, how are these initiatives doing and in different communities. Those frameworks, I think it's quite difficult, like working with local partners to show them that, you're doing good in this, but not in that and that. And I think there's a narrative here that it's really, really difficult actually to deal with. At least I find it difficult, which is like if we're saying to partners like implementing actually quite good initiatives, that you're not doing good enough or you're not doing enough criteria so that this change can actually be transformative. And I guess that I'm stucking more and more into this, or I'm stumbling more and more into this view that, well, maybe it's not, the point is that it's not a single organization that should be doing everything. The point is how do we collaborate together? The point is how do we make different initiatives to collaborate together? And how sort of we do exactly what you were talking about, which is also like, can we make so that the cross-scale interaction, could be unlocking some of those collaborations? And how do we build those capacities? I think when we talk about capacities, we often like sort of are talking about the capacities of the communities in the ground, but actually like the capacity to cross-scale is like a very big thing in itself, right? And so, yeah, I'm sorry if it was a fuzzy question or comment. I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll respond, but maybe, this is an open question to everybody. But I think it is how do you hold that complexity? And we've heard from a couple of examples, things are either put into different disciplines, different sectors. There's often this false dichotomy that it's either adaptation or mitigation. It's either transformative development or it's climate resilient development or it's resilience or it's sustainability. And I think those words are sometimes used to ambush negotiations, to stall conversations. And so it is this, how do we build those capacities? And they often sit within people and they don't know how to name it, but it is that brokering capacity, that leveraging capacity, the mobilizing capacity. One thing that came out strongly from some of the work and engaging with local actors that are on the ground is that the mobilizing capacity. How do you build those solidarity networks? Because it is about not one organization, one individual doing everything, because the strength does come in numbers. But then how do you also build the capacity to intervene in some of the big conversations that people aren't invited to? And how do you supply evidence in multiple different ways that produces both kind of evidence from diverse knowledge, but also options. So people often like, we can't, don't just give us science, don't just give us evidence, but also give us some options that it's informed by evidence as well. And those capacities are really hard, but they are strengthened by learning. So having opportunities for people to say, well, this is my challenge with engaging, at a very local level, in the middle, at global levels, doing that brokering work across those different scales. Because I think you start realizing that either you already have that capacity, or you've got some tips and tricks, or you can understand maybe some processes to build those capacities in different ways. So I think it is a really hard job, and that work is often done. It's hidden work, it's unnamed work, but it's really important work. And how can those intermediary organizations or individuals fulfill that role that they almost building capacity, so that they're working themselves out of a job as well, so that you have these other people that can take those positions to do that as their work as well. So I don't know if there's anyone else that wants to comment on that question.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try. And maybe if I may share a case or an example. So I'm Carl, I work with CARE, and we were lucky enough to get a small fund from a foundation in the US where they said, go away and learn what locally led adaptation is in practice. So in Southern Province in Zambia, we engaged with communities that we have been working with, as well as local authorities, national authorities, scientists, learning partners. And we spent a couple of years investing in the capacity and vulnerability analysis in a participatory way with communities, but with those local authorities involved in the process. Including the Ministry of Water, for example, Ministry of Agriculture, local development. So they were observing, not only observing, actually they were participating in the process of capacity and vulnerability identification. And then there was an adaptation, a locally led adaptation planning process. The communities put their own plan together, and we gave a sort of a grant, a micro grant to these communities to implement the plan. So at the end of this process, we took everybody to a learning event and did sort of precisely what you're saying, Nadia, is like brokering the relationships between the actors that matter. And for at least my learning, I was at the event, and my learning from that is that the most important relationship is between the citizen, the communities, and the state at the lowest possible level, because that's where there are personal relationships and there's social accountability between citizen and state at that level. So if communities have confidence in their local authorities to be able to deliver, and the local authority has confidence in the state to provide the resources, then we can see progress. And I think the plan, so far so good. I mean, we're going to not see real impact for probably another few years, but I think the process of brokering and strengthening trust and accountability between communities and those who are responsible for providing the services, that's impact itself. That's a metric. It's a process metric that is enshrined in sort of good governance and rights, actually, the right to all of the things that people have rights to.
Thank you. That was an excellent example. And I guess we have 5 minutes, so we'll wrap up. Right time to hand over to David, who will close.
For some sessions, this is a difficult task because they go over the place, but I think for this session there's some common threads, and I really like the ending comment, because that opens up a really good space for conversation, which is, why are we so focused on having metrics that assess a particular outcome and not so focused on having a process to assess the processes by which locally led adaptation is being implemented or by which funding is being devolved to local communities. So perhaps that's an entry point, having a set of metrics, if we want to call it that way, by which we assess the process rather than the outcome itself. And that actually relates to a comment that was mentioned, I think, by Aita or Charles at the beginning, which was the process of capacity building is actually the basis of the evidence. And this was in the first question where we started highlighting this. And so we need to come back and identify the process by which we build capacities is a process of creation of evidence, of adaptive learning, where we can actually go back and look back into the successes, but also the failures that took place during the process. And we can also use that to make accountable those that are on top, to say, hey, this was not the right way to address the implementation of a given project, and we need to think back into how we implement this. But also, it helps us amplify the voices of those that are actually implementing the projects, including grassroots level actors who are actually learning through the process, gaining agency, building governance, and strengthening the process by which they also engage with other actors in the community, such as the state, at the local level, at higher scales. And I just want to kind of wrap this all up by saying this all takes place in a very complex system, which is not the system of resilience and adaptation or loss and damage. It takes place at the level of the communities, which are quite complex with different systems nested one with each other. And therefore, there was someone, sorry, I have it in my notes, but someone mentioned about questioning GDP as a basic metrics of progress and achievement of outcomes. And I think if we go more into assessing the process, we then will start to question ourselves whether these economic metrics are actually telling us what we want them to tell us in terms of building adaptation and resilience.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I think we wrap up the session. Hopefully, we will continue these conversations in different forums. So not the first, not the last conversation on locally led adaptation metrics. Please reach out to us. So the Resilience Evidence Coalition is available on LinkedIn as a group. But that's one of the spaces. Please feel free to reach out to us over email or write to us, and we're always happy to chat. Thank you very much. And that's it. Thank you.